I felt the jolt before I heard the metal screech. My daughter-in-law had pushed me from the ramp. My leg split open on the edge, pain burning through me. But worse was the silence. My son stood at the top, eyes locked on mine, and did nothing. After a lifetime of raising him, that was his choice. So I made mine. I pushed them both out of my will, by name, by signature, forever. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The afternoon air smelled of charcoal and sweet corn, heavy with laughter that wasn't hers. Paper plates bent under ribs and potato salad. Wet grass stuck to shoes. Bees nosed the open soda cans. And someone's country playlist rattled from a speaker near the porch. Irene Mallory moved carefully across the yard, her walker steadying each step. The ramp up to the porch gleamed dull gray, paint chipped and warped by summers of sun and winters of frost. She knew every squeak, every uneven plank, because she had traveled it 1,000 times since the hip surgery. Shannon Mallory appeared at the base of the ramp, balancing a tray of sweating glasses. Her smile had the shine of glass about to crack. "You're blocking the whole thing," she said with a sigh, as if the words were an afterthought, but sharp enough to slice. Irene paused, resting her weight on the walker. "Almost there," she said, calm as ever. But Shannon didn't wait. She pressed her hip forward, nudging the walker with more force than necessary. The metal frame jolted against the side panel. Irene's knees buckled. She felt her shin scrape, skin splitting against the rough edge before she caught herself, clutching the rail with both hands. Pain shot up her leg, hot and immediate, but her lips tightened instead of opening. At the top of the steps stood Eric, her only son. His paper plate tilted as he froze, eyes flicking from his wife to his mother. He didn't move, didn't speak, just shifted his weight, as if silence were safer than siding. Blood already marked Irene's pant leg in a thin crimson streak. She breathed once, twice, and straightened her back. "I'm fine," she said, voice even, though her hand trembled against the rail. Shannon gave a breezy laugh. "See?" Just a little bump. She stepped past, setting the drinks down on the porch table as if nothing had happened. Eric nodded faintly, as though agreement cost less than truth. He looked away, greeting a cousin who called his name. The music swelled. Someone yelled for another round of burgers. The world went on, careless. Irene climbed the rest of the ramp alone, walker rattling against the boards. She felt each throb in her leg as a private reminder. The wound was hers to carry. Inside the house, the air was cooler, heavy with coleslaw and barbecue smoke clinging to the curtains. She excused herself, telling no one where she was going, and slipped down the hall. The bathroom door shut softly behind her. The mirror showed what she already knew. Her lips were pale, eyes lined deeper than usual. A woman steadying herself in a storm no one else noticed. She lowered onto the closed toilet seat, slowly rolling her pant leg up. The scrape wasn't small, skin peeled back in an ugly gash, bruising already blooming purple around it. Blood welled and trickled in tiny rivers. For a moment, Irene pressed the hem of a tissue against it. The sharp sting made her eyes water, but she refused tears. She leaned closer, whispering the truth only the porcelain sink could hear. "I'm not fine." The morning after the barbecue, Irene Mallory woke to the ache in her shin before her eyes even opened. Sunlight spilled across her bedroom carpet, bright enough to catch the faint dried streak of blood on her leg. The bruise had risen high around the gash, a deep purple bloom spreading wider than she had feared. It throbbed with every shift of her foot against the sheet. The house was silent, except for the low rattle of wind chimes outside. Irene moved slowly, rising with the help of her walker. She had endured aches before, decades of factory shifts, long hours on concrete floors, the wear of time itself. But this was different. This was inflicted. By late morning, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Deirdre Briggs didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed the door open, cane clicking against the wood floor as she came inside. "Where are you?" she called, already knowing the answer. "In here," Irene said from the kitchen, her voice even but tired. Deirdre set her bag on the table and narrowed her eyes the moment she saw the limp. "Let me see." Irene sat down, lifting her pant leg without hesitation. The wound was raw, swollen, rimmed in angry shades of red and purple. Deirdre's jaw tightened. "That is no accident. That's pressure. That's push." She pulled out a bottle of antiseptic, gauze, and a phone. The antiseptic stung sharply as it touched the torn skin, filling the air with its bitter chemical smell. Irene didn't wince. Instead, she folded her hands on the table and stared straight ahead while Deirdre snapped photos. Click. A close-up of the scrape. Timestamp burning across the corner. Click. The wider angle, her face unflinching, the wound visible. Click. A shot with her hand pointing to the bruise, steady as stone. "You'll want them all," Deirdre muttered, angling for better light. Old women are always accused of imagining things, but timestamps, they're louder than gossip. Irene nodded once, then reached for the drawer beside her chair. She pulled out a hard-bound logbook, its spine worn from years of notes. Each page carried her tidy handwriting: blood pressure readings, medication times, weather observations, even grocery prices. She turned to a clean sheet and wrote deliberately, the pen pressing hard. Into the paper. Ramp incident. July 8th, 4:43 p.m. When she set the pen down, the words seemed heavier than the page itself. Deirdre studied her a moment, then leaned back in her chair. Her tone softened, but only slightly. "You've got 3 weapons they can't touch: time, strength, and your signature. Use all 3. The kettle whistled on the stove. Irene rose carefully, pouring hot water into 2 mugs, the steam rising between them. "I'm changing the documents," she said simply, placing one mug in front of her friend. Deirdre smiled, but it was thin, edged with something fierce. "That's the Irene I know." Later that afternoon, Irene sat at her desk with her laptop open. Notifications flickered across the screen. Shannon had posted a gallery from the barbecue. Bright pictures of children holding sparklers, cousins grinning around platters of ribs, Eric laughing with a beer in hand. The table crowded with pitchers of lemonade. Not a single photo showed Irene. It was as if she hadn't been there at all. Her absence was the quiet centerpiece of every frame. Deirdre, peering over her shoulder, let out a dry laugh. She's already rewriting the story. In her version, you don't even exist. Irene closed the laptop. Her wound still throbbed, but beneath the sting she felt a steadiness she hadn't in years. The bruise was proof, yes, but so were her records, her logbook, her friend with the sharp tongue and sharper memory. The house settled into silence again. Outside, cicadas droned endlessly. Inside, Irene pressed her fingers against the logbook cover, as though sealing her resolve into the paper itself. Her phone buzzed against the table, vibrating until it rattled a spoon. She turned it over. A message from Eric glowed on the screen. "Sorry about yesterday, as she didn't mean it. You okay?" Irene read the words twice, her throat tightening. Not what happened. Not why didn't I help. Just a dismissal wrapped in apology, soft enough to sting harder. Irene typed her reply slowly, each letter deliberate. "Yes, thanks for asking." She hit send and set the phone face down on the counter. That was all he would get. The kettle hissed again, steam fogging the narrow kitchen window. She poured herself tea, the scent of mint curling through the air, sharp and grounding. Her hand steadied around the mug as she turned to the old filing drawer in the corner. It groaned when she pulled it open, the metal resistant as though guarding what waited inside. She sifted past decades of life. Pay stubs yellowed with age, warranty slips for appliances long gone, letters from Eric when he was away at college. Then she reached the thick envelope bound with a rubber band. Inside lay her will, last updated nearly a decade ago. The paper smelled faintly of dust and ink, its corners softened from years of handling. Irene flattened it on the table. Her neat signature trailed across the bottom, her voice frozen in black ink. Her eyes scanned, the percentages written in tidy lines. Eric, 70%. Noah, 30%. Shannon's name wasn't written anywhere, yet Irene knew what her son assumed. Assets split in spirit, if not in writing. Shannon would inherit through Eric, slide into comfort on Irene's life's work without ever lifting a finger. Irene's lips pressed into a thin line. She flipped the last page over and reached for her pen. On the blank back, she wrote in firm strokes, "No more assumptions." The words looked stark against the page, as though they had been waiting for her all along. Deirdre sat across the table, watching with sharp eyes. She didn't sip her tea. She didn't blink much either. "You know what this means," she said finally. "Yes," Irene answered, sliding the pen back into its holder. "It means I need a better lock than my own handwriting." Deirdre leaned forward, her cane tapping the floor in emphasis. "Then we bring in Stephen. He doesn't flinch, and he doesn't leave doors open." Not even a crack. Irene allowed herself a small, humorless smile. "That's what I want. No contests, no loopholes, no appeals. When I close a door, it stays shut." The house creaked with the sound of settling wood. Outside, a dog barked faintly down the street, the kind of suburban noise Irene had long since tuned out. Inside, the air was taut, filled with a quiet resolve that smelled of peppermint tea and antiseptic gauze. Irene gathered the papers together, slipping them back into their folder. But when she reached into the drawer again, her fingers brushed against something else, another folder, heavier, bound with a faded blue cover. She pulled it free. Across the front, in her own careful handwriting, were the words, "Living Trust, Draft, 2012. For a long moment, Irene stared at it, the edges of her reflection glinting faintly on the glossy surface. The folder had slept for years, untouched, waiting for the day she might need it. She set it down in front of her tea, her fingers resting on it like a pulse. Deirdre raised an eyebrow. "Looks like you already started digging your moat a long time ago." Irene didn't answer. She was too busy flipping open the cover, the past suddenly rushing forward into the present. The folder sat heavy on Irene Mallory's lap, its edges worn from years of being ignored. She carried it into the office of Stephen Cho, like it was evidence in a trial only she knew existed. The building smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish, the kind of order Irene found comforting. Stephen rose as she entered, trim in a charcoal suit, his expression unreadable. His office walls were lined with framed certificates and photos of him at courthouse steps. No family pictures, no clutter, only precision. "Irene," he greeted, voice even, extending a hand across the table. She shook it, her grip steady despite the bruise hidden beneath her pant leg. She laid the folder down. "I've documented everything." Stephen opened it, methodical. Inside were the photos Deirdre had taken, the printouts with timestamps, and Irene's meticulous logbook entries. He read each page without interruption, eyes moving like a scanner. He didn't offer pity. He didn't soften his expression. When he finished, he stacked the papers in a neat pile and folded his hands. "You're prepared," he said. "That makes this easier. An ordinary will can be contested. Yours will not be." "What's stronger than a will?" Irene asked, voice calm, though her fingers tapped lightly against her walker. "An irrevocable trust with a personal addendum," he replied without hesitation. "It locks the assets, removes ambiguity, and states intent. Once signed, it cannot be changed or undone. Not by you, not by them, not by anyone." Irene leaned forward. "I want to name names." "Their names." Stephen didn't blink. "You should." He reached for a yellow legal pad, jotting quickly as he spoke. "House, savings, car, bond ladder, all assigned to your grandson, Noah, held until he turns 25. Trustee oversight until then. And Eric?" Stephen set down his pen. Disinherited. Shannon as well. The exclusion will be explicit, with a statement of cause attached. Irene breathed in, the scent of lemon polish sharp in her nose. Then put it on record. They won't just lose it by omission, they'll lose it by name. His gaze flicked toward her, measuring, then nodded. It will stand stronger that way. The notary was called in, a woman in a crisp blazer with a seal pressed neatly into her folder. Irene signed each page without hesitation, the scratch of her pen loud in the silent room. The ink didn't waver. She pressed harder on the final line, her name anchoring itself like iron. Deirdre sat nearby, arms folded, watching like a hawk. She didn't even blink, she murmured. Blinking is for doubt, Irene said, pushing the papers back toward Stephen. And I don't have any. He gathered the documents, sliding them into a fireproof folder. His voice remained steady, but there was a flicker of approval in his eyes. They won't be able to even open a challenge, Mrs. Mallory. It will die on the courthouse steps before it reaches a judge. Irene exhaled, a slow release she hadn't known she was holding. Then let them pound fists on a closed door. Outside, rain had started, tapping against the window with steady rhythm. Irene found herself listening to it, the sound almost soothing. For the first time since the ramp incident, she felt something close to control. Stephen stood. I'll prepare the finalized copy for filing. In the meantime, keep your documentation. Every note, every photo, Irene nodded. They'll keep trying. Yes, he agreed. But now they're trying against paper, not just against you. When Irene left the office, the rain had softened to drizzle. The air smelled clean, washed of the day's heat. She gripped her walker firmly and moved toward the car where Deirdre was waiting. You look lighter, Deirdre said as she opened the passenger door. I cut a weight loose, Irene answered. Back home, she set the folder in her desk drawer, sliding it into place like a final piece of a puzzle. She poured herself a glass of water, her body tired, but her resolve sharpened. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, screen glowing with a new message. Hey, Eric said you're updating stuff. Just make sure we're all covered. It was from Shannon. Irene set the phone down without replying, the screen still lit, her reflection faint in the glass. The notary's stamp landed with a heavy thunk, pressing gold into the corner of Irene Mallory's irrevocable trust. Ink and seal bound the document tighter than blood ever had. The office smelled faintly of toner and metal polish, the air humming with the sound of permanence. Stephen Cho gathered the signed pages, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. This is official now, he said, sliding the papers into a thick binder. The trust is irrevocable. It's not a draft. It's not a placeholder. It is final. The court will recognize it as such. Irene adjusted her glasses, her face impassive. Good. Then let's make sure every line says exactly what I intend. He opened to the addendum, reading aloud in his measured voice. Beneficiary, Noah Mallory, 100% of assets, accessible in full at age 25. Trustee oversight until that date. Deirdre, perched in the corner like a sentry, gave a sharp nod. That boy deserves it. He's the only one who stood beside you, Stephen continued. Eric Mallory and Shannon Mallory, specifically named and excluded from inheritance. Cause stated, physical harm inflicted, neglect witnessed by third party, and willful disregard. The words hit the air like stones dropped into still water. Irene sat straighter, her chin lifted. She let the silence expand before she spoke. Make sure my name and my words carry the weight of that truth. I want it filed in black and white. No room for them to wriggle out. Stephen slid the binder toward her, the pen resting atop the final page. Then all that's left is your signature. Irene picked it up. The pen felt cool in her hand, balanced, heavier than it should have. She looked at the line, her name waiting like a locked door. Without hesitation, she signed. Her hand didn't tremble, her letters didn't falter. Deirdre whispered, almost to herself. Not even a blink. The notary leaned in, applying her seal with a firm press. The sound was sharp, final. Irene placed the pen down neatly and folded her hands on the table. Stephen closed the binder with a snap. His voice carried no softness, only certainty. They won't be able to even open a challenge. The exclusion is airtight. A judge will toss out any attempt before it's read in court. Irene's reply was measured, her voice carrying the quiet force of a verdict. Then let them pound fists on a closed door. For a moment, the only sound was the soft shuffle of papers being filed into Stephen's casebox. Rain ticked against the tall window, faint thunder rolling far away in the hills. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the clean cut Irene had just made to her family tree. She stood slowly, gripping her walker, the rubber tips pressing into the carpet. The office lights cast a pale glow across her face, sharpening the lines of resolve etched there. "You did the right thing," Stephen said as he rose. "The right thing," Irene answered, "isn't always the easy one." They left the office together, Deirdre walking close at her side. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp with the smell of wet asphalt. Irene inhaled deeply, the damp air cool against her lungs. For the first time in weeks, her body felt lighter, as if her walker bore less weight than before. At home, she tucked the certified copies into her desk drawer, sliding them beneath her logbook. The bruise on her shin still ached, but now it carried a different meaning. Not just harm, but proof. Not just injury, but cause. Deirdre busied herself in the kitchen, rummaging through the mail stacked on the counter. She shuffled envelopes aside until she plucked out a small card. "This was in your pile," she said, handing it over. The front was blank except for a scrawl in blue ink, just a name and number written hastily. Irene flipped it over. On the back, in Shannon's unmistakable handwriting, was another name, House Appraiser. The words sank like ice into the quiet kitchen. The card with the appraiser's name still sat on Irene Mallory's kitchen counter when her phone rang the next morning. The voicemail came in a polite male voice. "Mrs. Mallory, this is Patrick from Asheville Home Values. I just wanted to follow up. Have you thought about selling?" The words felt unreal, like hearing your own obituary read aloud while you were still alive. Irene lowered the phone, her eyes traveling slowly across her living room, the floral curtains, the wood-paneled walls, the bookshelf lined with photo albums. Every corner carried decades of her life. Selling wasn't just a transaction, it was erasure. She replayed the voicemail for Deirdre, who was already riffling through a folder of notes. "Selling?" Deirdre repeated sharply, her cane striking the floor like a gavel. "And you didn't call them? That's Shannon. Has to be." Without waiting for a reply, she snatched the card and dialed the number scribbled on it. The speakerphone crackled, and after a few rings, the same male voice answered cheerfully. "Patrick, Asheville Home Values," he said. "This is Deirdre Briggs, calling on behalf of Mrs. Mallory," Deirdre snapped. "Who asked you to run a valuation on her property?" There was a pause, the sound of keyboard tapping faint in the background. Our request came from a Mrs. Shannon Mallory. She mentioned she was the daughter-in-law. Said Mrs. Mallory was considering downsizing. I assumed." "You assumed wrong," Deirdre cut in. Her voice was ice. "Cancel whatever you've got on file." Irene sat quietly through the call, hands folded on her lap, her heart steady but heavy. When the line clicked dead, she whispered, "She's circling already." Stephen Cho didn't need to be told twice. That afternoon, Irene met him again, this time with urgency in her stride. Despite the walker, he clicked his pen once, his face unreadable. "We'll file an ownership lock through the trust," he said. "No one can sell, transfer, or touch the title without trustee authorization. It closes the trap door before they even step near it." Irene nodded. "Do it. If they want this house, they'll have to dig through concrete." The paperwork moved quickly. Within days, all utilities, electricity, water, gas, were transferred into the trust name. Property taxes, too. Irene insisted every bill carry the new heading, Mallory Living Trust. She checked each envelope herself, sliding them neatly into her filing cabinet. It was as though the house itself had been armored. But Shannon wasn't done. One evening, Irene logged onto her email and found a forwarded message from Noah. The subject line read, "Grandma, look what she sent Dad." Attached was a Zillow link with a cheerful caption, "Just examples for Mom." The link opened to glossy photos of ranch-style homes, all one story with ramps already attached, staged like brochures for a future Irene hadn't asked for. "She's talking like it's already hers," Noah muttered from across the table. His voice was low but certain, his 14-year-old eyes sharper than most adults. Irene clicked the link closed and looked at him. "She can talk." "Talking doesn't make it true," Noah leaned back, shaking his head. "It's like she thinks you're not even here." Irene didn't answer. Instead, she placed her palm on the logbook that now sat open on the table. The pages already carried the ramp incident, the bruise photos, and the trust signatures. She added a new line in her steady script. July 14th, Shannon requested property valuation, unsolicited. The act steadied her breathing. Every word written down was another nail in the wall between them. That night, while folding laundry, Irene's phone buzzed again. She picked it up, expecting a routine message. Instead, her eyes fixed on the subject line of a forwarded email. The sender was her doctor's office, the recipient, a Shannon Mallory, and the request, bold as daylight, full medical records release. Irene's laundry slipped from her hands. The shirts and towels fell in a soft heap at her feet, but the cold that ran through her chest felt anything but soft. By morning, Irene was already at her doctor's office, the familiar tang of antiseptic in the air. The nurse raised an eyebrow when she saw the folder tucked beneath Irene's arm. "Routine visit?" "Not quite," Irene replied evenly. "I want my chart." "Every page. And I want today's results," added Dr. Kendall, her primary physician for over a decade, studied her carefully when she explained the situation. Irene's voice didn't waver. Her words were clipped and factual. He nodded, then ordered a cognitive screening on the spot. The questions came quickly: date, time, current events, memory recall. Irene answered each one without hesitation, her gaze steady. When it ended, Dr. Kendall tapped his pen against the chart. "No decline. No red flags. You're sharper than half the staff here." "Put that in writing," Irene said, sliding her logbook across his desk. By the time she left the office, her medical file was printed, stamped, and sealed. The papers rustled inside her folder like armor. Back at Stephen Cho's office, she laid everything before him. He scanned the results with clinical precision. "This is strong," he said. "I'll file capacity affidavits with the trust. If they try to argue incompetence, these records shut it down." He stamped each page with his office seal, the sound final and satisfying. Meanwhile, Deirdre had been digging of her own. She appeared that afternoon with a sheet fresh from her home printer. "This is the request Shannon sent to your provider," she said, sliding it across the table. "Denied. She has no power of attorney, no legal standing." Irene studied the denial notice. The words "request refused" were bold at the top, a wall Shannon had already tried and failed to climb. Irene exhaled, steady and controlled. "Good. But I don't want her or Eric near any decisions about me. Not medical, not financial, not anything that night." Irene wrote a new directive in her careful script. Eric Mallory and Shannon Mallory are excluded from all health-related decisions, including emergencies. She signed it, pressed her notary seal against the bottom, and slid the page into her logbook. Noah arrived after school, his backpack thumping against the chair as he dropped it. "Grandma, Mom's been whispering on the phone again." "I think it's about you." Irene offered a small, tired smile. "That's why we're locking things down." Together, they unboxed a new pill dispenser Deirdre had ordered online. It clicked open with a code, the compartment sealed until the timer released them. Noah tested it twice, grinning when it worked. "This way nobody can mess with your meds," he said. His fingers lingered on the device, protective in a way that seemed older than his years. Irene rested her hand on his. "I'm proud of you, Noah. You see things others pretend not to." He shrugged but didn't look away. For a brief moment, the house felt safe again. Documents sealed, medicines locked, Noah beside her. But safety never lasted long in this new war. A week later, the mail brought an envelope stamped with the county crest. Irene slid it open with her letter opener, the blade sharp against paper. Inside was a formal letter from Elder Services. "Concerns have been raised regarding your well-being. A home visit will be scheduled." Her hand stilled on the page. The bruise on her leg, still faintly visible, seemed to pulse as if it remembered. She folded the letter carefully, slid it into her logbook, and whispered into the silence of the kitchen. "So they've raised the stakes." The knock on Irene Mallory's door came at 10 sharp, firm, and official. Through the glass, she saw a woman in a gray county-issued jacket, clipboard in hand, badge clipped to her collar. Adult Protective Services. Irene opened the door slowly, her walker steady in front of her. "Mrs. Mallory," the agent asked, voice professional but measured. "That's me," Irene replied. Her tone was calm, almost serene. Though her stomach coiled like a tightened spring, the agent stepped inside, eyes sweeping the living room, the tidy couch cushions, the neat stack of folded laundry, the faint scent of lemon cleaner lingering in the air. "We received a call expressing concerns about your well-being. Do you mind if I ask a few questions?" "Of course," Irene said, motioning toward the dining table. "I've been expecting you." She reached for the thick folder on the counter, the one she had prepared days ago. It landed on the table with a deliberate weight. The agent opened it, her pen stalling as she flipped through page after page. Photos of the ramp incident, timestamps neatly circled, logbook entries written in Irene's precise script, affidavits from Dr. Kendall confirming cognitive strength, notarized trust documents. Every page carried a date, a seal, or a signature. The agent looked up, almost startled. "You've documented everything." Irene folded her hands neatly on the table. "I don't forget. And I don't imagine." I record the agent's eyes lingered on the bruise photo. The fresh edge of the wound captured in sharp resolution. She closed the folder and exhaled slowly. "Mrs. Mallory, this complaint doesn't align with what I see here. You're clear. This was retaliation." The word hung in the air like a gavel strike. Retaliation. Irene nodded once. "Then you'll file your own report?" "Yes," the agent confirmed, sliding her card across the table. "You'll receive the paperwork. And if they try again, you call me directly." When the door shut behind her, the silence felt victorious. Irene's walker squeaked as she moved back to her desk, the weight in her chest loosening for the first time that day. Stephen Cho didn't waste a minute when she called. By evening, a courier had picked up the APS paperwork and returned with a fresh draft from his office. Irene sat at her kitchen table, the lamp casting a pool of light over the legal language. Slander, retaliation, pre-litigation notice. The words carried teeth. "They came after me with lies," Irene murmured, signing the document. "I'm answering with truth, stamped and sealed." Hours later, her phone lit up with Noah's number. She pressed it to her ear, his voice spilling out in a rush. "Grandma, I heard what happened. Dad's mad. Mom's acting like nothing's wrong, but I just wanted to say, I'm really proud of you." Her chest softened at his words. She closed her eyes and let his voice linger, steady and sure, before the line clicked silent. She set the phone down and turned back to her folder system. The new papers slid neatly into a section she labeled in thick black ink. July, control attempts. The drawer closed with a solid thunk, order restored. The night was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant song of crickets outside. Irene poured herself a glass of water, the kitchen light warm around her. She allowed herself a small smile, tight but real. For once, she wasn't reacting. She was building her own wall, brick by brick. Then came another knock. softer this time, drawn out. Irene froze, her hand on the counter. Through the glass, she saw Shannon standing there, bouquet of supermarket flowers clutched in both hands. Her smile stretched too wide. "Let's clear the air," Shannon called. Her voice sing-song sweet, as though the past weeks had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. Irene's fingers tightened around her glass. The flowers swayed in Shannon's grip, bright and plastic under the porch light. Through the screen door, Irene Mallory could see the stems trembling in Shannon's grip. The bouquet was the kind you grabbed at a grocery store on impulse. Bright daisies, filler greenery, wrapped in cellophane that crinkled under her nervous fingers. The sweetness of their petals couldn't mask the stench of performance. Irene didn't unlock the door. She stood steady, her walker angled in front of her like a silent guard. "Come on, Irene," Shannon said with an almost pleading brightness. "We're family. Let's move past it." Her smile wavered, more brittle than soft. Irene's reply was calm, her tone flat as a page. "You pushed me." Shannon rolled her eyes, the flowers dipping with the motion. "It was a stumble. You lost your footing. Don't turn it into something it wasn't." Irene didn't blink. "And Eric?" He saw it. He said nothing. For the first time, Shannon faltered. Her voice sharpened, defensive. "He's just caught in the middle. You know how he is. He doesn't like conflict." Irene's gaze held steady, her silence louder than any accusation. Then she said softly, "He always was." The wind chimes clinked faintly on the porch, carrying the weight of a pause that stretched longer than comfort allowed. Shannon pressed the bouquet closer to the screen, the cellophane squeaking. "Look, this has gotten way out of hand. I brought you flowers, for God's sake. Can we just reset? Forget the ugliness?" Irene bent slowly, reached into the side table by the door, and pulled out a sealed envelope. The flap was crisp, the paper thick. She slid it through the narrow gap at the bottom of the screen. The envelope tapped softly against Shannon's shoe. Shannon bent, confusion flashing across her face as she picked it up. "What's this?" "The final copy," Irene said evenly. "Exclusion clause. Signed, sealed, filed. You and Eric, by name." For a heartbeat, the only sound was the low hum of cicadas in the trees. Then Shannon tore the flap open, yanking out the documents as though the paper itself had wronged her. Her eyes skimmed the lines. Her name, Eric's, the words disinherited and cause stated. Her chest rose and fell quickly, the bouquet slipping from her arm and thudding onto the porch. Daisies scattered like witnesses fleeing. "You can't do this," she hissed. "I already did." Her voice had no tremor, no heat, just fact. Shannon's breath came sharp, ragged. She clutched the papers in her fist, crumpling the edges as if distortion could erase the ink. "Eric doesn't even know the half of this. He'll fight you. He'll do what he always does," Irene interrupted, her eyes narrowing slightly. "He'll look away." The words landed heavier than any accusation. Shannon's mouth opened, then closed again. Her jaw tightened, her cheeks flushed red. She looked younger suddenly, not polished and brittle, but cornered and desperate. The silence between them stretched until the sound of a car door slamming down the street broke it. Somewhere, a neighbor's dog barked. The ordinary world kept moving, blind to the fracture unfolding on Irene's porch. Shannon's grip on the papers shook. She stepped closer to the screen, her voice rising, losing its sugary veneer. "You'll regret this when you're gone." The words were a scream, raw and cracked, echoing across the quiet street. Inside, Irene didn't flinch. She stood behind her walker, the wind chimes tinkling faintly above her, her eyes fixed steady on the woman outside the door. The morning after Shannon's outburst, Irene's voicemail was clogged with messages. One started in a syrupy tone, "I just lost my temper, Irene, but you know I care about you," and ended in a brittle warning, "Don't let outsiders make decisions for our family." Another was quieter, Eric's voice in the background, urging her to at least talk to us before doing anything drastic. Irene deleted them all without listening to the end. Each click of the delete button felt like closing a door they'd never open again. By midweek, Stephen Cho filed the trust certification with the county courthouse. The stamp on the papers was heavy, the kind that didn't wash off. He called Irene that evening, his voice steady as always. "It's official. The house is out of reach. No sale, no transfer, no inheritance. Not through them, not through anyone." Irene sat at her desk, running her fingers along the grain of the wood. "Good," she said quietly. "It belongs to Noah's future now, not their schemes." The house itself seemed to breathe easier, its wooden beams creaking softly in the night, as if relieved to know it had been saved from greedy hands. Deirdre came over 2 days later, her cane tapping a steady rhythm as she walked through the door with a stack of folders. "Passwords," she announced, dropping into the chair beside Irene. "You need a manager. No sticky notes under keyboards, no scraps of paper in drawers." They'd comb this place if they thought it would help them. They spent hours at the kitchen table, Irene reading off account names, while Deirdre typed them into a secure program. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, punctuated by the occasional squeak of Irene's walker when she stood to fetch another file. When they finished, Deirdre handed her a small envelope. Inside was a single key. "For Noah. He's old enough to carry one now. If anything happens, he needs access." Irene held the key in her palm, its weight far greater than its size. "He won't lose it," she said. That evening, after Deirdre left, Irene sat alone at her desk again. She pulled out a draft of her obituary, a document she had started years ago in one of her organized moods. Tonight she picked up her pen and crossed out lines. She removed Eric's name. She removed Shannon's. Then, with deliberate strokes, she added, "Survived by one who never looked away." The words glowed back at her, stark and truthful. The following afternoon, Joanne from next door knocked softly before stepping in, carrying a glass dish wrapped in a towel. "Peach cobbler," she said with a smile, setting it down on the counter. The warm sweetness filled the kitchen, cinnamon and sugar hanging in the air. Irene offered her a chair, and the two women ate together, the crust flaky, the peaches syrupy and rich. For the first time in weeks, Irene let herself enjoy a meal without feeling the weight of strategy behind it. But peace was short-lived. As twilight settled, her phone buzzed on the counter. Single new message blinked across the screen. From Eric. "Did you really cut us out?" Just that. No greeting, no explanation. Irene stared at the words, the cobbler cooling untouched beside her. Outside, the cicadas droned louder, as though the night itself leaned in to hear her response. She pulled a sheet of paper from her drawer, the kind she saved for formal letters. Her pen hovered for a moment before she wrote a single sentence in clean, deliberate script. "I cut you out the day you looked away." No flourish, no explanation, just truth distilled into ink. She slid the page into an envelope, sealed it, and walked slowly to the printer in the corner. The machine whirred, spitting out a duplicate copy she set aside for her own files. The faint scent of warm paper filled the room. When both versions were ready, she addressed one to her son. Then, with Noah by her side, she took it to the post office. The clerk stamped it, certified mail. The thunk of the rubber stamp echoed louder than expected, like a gavel striking wood. Irene watched as the envelope disappeared behind the counter. A piece of her history, gone into the system, carrying no return. Back home, Stephen Cho received the scanned duplicate. His voice over the phone was steady as ever. "I'll upload this to the trust archive. Even correspondence can matter later. It becomes part of the record good," Irene said. "Let every word be permanent." Noah hovered at her shoulder, frowning slightly. "You don't even sound angry, Grandma." Not after all this, she turned to him, her expression soft but resolute. "I'm not angry, Noah. I'm done." There's a difference. He seemed to roll that thought around, his young brow furrowing as if weighing it like a puzzle. "Done," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. Later, when Deirdre arrived, Irene relayed the story. Deirdre smirked, tapping her cane once against the floor. Done is more powerful than furious. Fury burns fast. Done leaves ash. The three of them gathered in the living room as Irene retrieved the final relic of her old life. Her outdated will, its edges were frayed, its language obsolete. She fed it into the shredder slowly, the machine chewing line by line until all that remained were ribbons of paper, limp and unreadable. The sound was oddly satisfying, like cutting ties she'd once thought unbreakable. When the last sheet vanished, Irene exhaled. That chapter's finished, Deirdre patted her shoulder. And the next one is yours to write. The evening was calm. They shared a pot of tea, the cicadas outside droning into the night. For once, Irene felt something close to peace. But peace rarely lasted long. When she finally sat down at her desk again, her phone buzzed with a new notification. This time, it wasn't a private message, but a public one. Shannon's name topped the post, bold and smug. Elder abuse is real. Some people fake being victims. The words clawed across the screen, dripping with implication. Irene's lips pressed into a line. She closed the phone without replying, but her reflection lingered in the black glass. The next morning, Irene dressed with purpose, pressed slacks, her good blouse, her walker freshly wiped down. She moved through the courthouse doors with the dignity of someone arriving not as a petitioner, but as a witness bearing evidence. The county clerk's office smelled faintly of paper and floor polish, the hum of copy machines filling the air. "I need to file a statement for the record," she told the clerk, sliding her envelope across the counter. Inside, her logbook entries, the APS clearance letter, photos of her leg, and a typed declaration in her steady prose. The clerk scanned the first page, glanced up at her, then stamped it with a solid "received." The sound echoed in Irene's chest like armor snapping into place. By the time she returned home, Stephen Cho's office had already fired back. Willard, his associate, drafted a takedown warning addressed directly to Shannon. Defamatory claims. Cease and desist, with pre-litigation consequences. Irene read it once, then set it in her July folder, neat and unshakable. Deirdre whistled when she saw it. "They're playing with matches in a room full of gasoline. You just handed them the fire marshal." That evening, Irene turned to another matter. She pulled out her funeral directive, the one tucked behind years of insurance papers. Her pen moved slowly but firmly. No access granted to Eric Mallory or Shannon Mallory at services or viewing. She signed and dated it, the final line drawn across the bridge that had already burned. The house itself seemed to shift with the decision. Irene stood in the hallway, looking up at the framed family portrait that had hung there for 20 years. Eric's arm around Shannon, Noah still small enough to be carried. She stared at her own younger smile, captured in softer years. She lifted the frame from the nail. The glass clinked faintly against the wall as she carried it to the closet and slid it behind a stack of boxes. When she returned, Noah was waiting in the living room with a new photo in hand. One of the two of them at the park last spring. He had set the timer on his phone that day, running back to wrap an arm around her as the camera clicked. The shot caught Irene mid-laugh, her hair caught in the breeze, Noah grinning proudly at her side. "Let's put this up instead," he said. His voice was quiet but steady. Together, they hung it where the old portrait had been. The image glowed warmly in the hallway light. Sharper, truer. "This one tells the truth," Irene said, her voice low but certain. The house felt different with it there, lighter, honest. The old frame was gone, but this picture, this moment, would hold. For a while, the evening was calm. They ate leftover cobbler, the air filled with cinnamon and sugar. Wind chimes stirred faintly on the porch. Noah read at the table while Irene wrote another log entry, her pen moving without pause. Then the phone rang. The caller ID displayed county probate clerk. Irene picked it up, her hand steady, her voice composed. "Mrs. Mallory," the clerk said, "I'm calling to confirm. Your trust has been received, and the 30-day challenge period has expired. Irene gripped the receiver tighter. The words carried weight, final and undeniable. Your filings are now uncontested and fully in effect, the clerk finished. The line clicked silent, but the echo of those words remained. For weeks, Irene Mallory had lived as though the air itself carried a countdown. Every day felt like a coin dropping into someone else's jar. Each hour, another chance for Eric and Shannon to throw a challenge into court. She imagined their voices rehearsed in lawyers' offices, their eyes hungry as they measured her home and her silence. But when the challenge period expired with no filing, the absence thundered louder than any accusation. Stephen Cho arrived the following morning, binder under his arm, his tie crisp, his shoes leaving damp prints across her porch from the rain. He set the binder on her kitchen table with a kind of solemn gravity, as though he were carrying not paper, but verdict. "It's finished," he said, opening to the first tab. "The trust is active, assets fully transferred. There is no mechanism left for appeal." He turned the pages one by one. The deed to her home, her savings accounts, the modest car title, the bond ladder she had carefully built through years of overtime shifts. Each was stamped, sealed, transferred under Noah's name. Each page was a lock, each signature a bar across the door. Irene rested her hands on the edge of the binder. Her pulse was steady, her voice quieter than the rain sliding down the window. "So they're out," Stephen nodded once. "Completely. They can yell at the courthouse steps if they like. No one will open the door." Deirdre, who had followed him in, gave a sharp laugh. "They'll scream themselves hoarse." "Good. Maybe it'll save the neighbors from hearing Shannon for once." The three shared a silence that was more powerful than celebration. Outside, the rain eased, leaving the air bright with that clean after-storm scent. Inside, Irene sat taller. Something invisible but heavy had slid off her shoulders. Later that afternoon, she returned to her desk. The smell of ink and manila folders filled the small room. She pulled out her healthcare directive, the one that still listed Eric as a backup decision-maker. Her pen scratched firmly across his name. In its place, she wrote, "Secondary Health POA, Deirdre Briggs." She signed and dated it, the ink bold against the page. That evening, she handed the fresh directive to Deirdre. Her friend raised an eyebrow. "So I get to decide when to pull the plug if you ever go stubborn on me." "You already boss me around daily," Irene replied, the corner of her mouth twitching upward. "Now you'll just have the paperwork to prove it." The laughter between them was brittle, but it filled the kitchen like a small victory. When the sun set, Irene sat alone with her tea. The cicadas screamed outside, their chorus relentless. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced down to see Eric's name glowing. One last try, for peace. The words blurred slightly in the glow of the screen. Peace. A word that once had warmth now felt like a prop dragged on stage too late. She thought of the ramp, the bruise, his silence hanging heavier than Shannon's shove. Her fingers moved deliberately across the keypad. Peace was possible. You looked away. She pressed send. The message left her phone with a quiet whoosh, carrying finality sharper than anger. She didn't look back at the screen. Instead, she pulled a fresh sheet of paper and began writing her legacy letter. Each line was plain-spoken, deliberate. Her reasons for choosing Noah, her record of harm, her decision to cut Eric and Shannon away. She explained how silence was not neutral. It was a choice. Her pen slowed only at the end. She thought for a moment, then pressed the final words onto the page with steady strokes. This is not spite. This is safety. She folded the letter carefully, smoothed the crease, and slid it into an envelope. The flap sealed with a press of her palm, warm against the paper. She placed it in the drawer beneath the trust binder, resting her hand there for a long moment, as though to lock it with more than wood. The clock on the wall ticked forward, indifferent, steady, but Irene no longer felt its weight pressing against her. The countdown that once belonged to them had ended. The time now belonged to her. The first wall wasn't brick or wood. It was a camera, sleek, unblinking, mounted to watch the ramp where Shannon had shoved her. Irene oversaw the installation from her porch chair, the faint hum of the drill mixing with the smell of sawdust and damp morning air. When the installer tested the feed, Irene saw herself appear on the small screen, framed by the chipped paint of her ramp. For the first time in months, she felt the space guarded. Now, she murmured, if anyone lays a hand on me, the world will see it too. The second wall was made of words. At the Asheville Senior Center, Irene volunteered for a workshop titled Document Your Life. The flyer promised tips on journaling, but Irene arrived with a binder thicker than any diary. She laid it open on the table. Photos of her leg, certified trust filings, notarized affidavits. The room went quiet as she spoke, her voice calm but unwavering. People will tell you you're overreacting. They'll tell you it's not worth the trouble. But trouble comes faster when you don't write things down. Several women scribbled notes, nodding. One man in the back raised his hand. What if your family gets angry at you for keeping records? Irene looked at him steadily. Then you're doing it right. Records aren't for them. They're for you. Later that evening, Noah sat at her desk, helping her prepare slides for the center's next session. His quick fingers flew over the keyboard, clicking images into place, while Irene watched the screen glow. See, he said proudly. This way you'll look like a pro. She smiled, the corners of her eyes softening. You're the pro. I just provide the story. When the final slide flickered up, her logbook entry labeled Ramp Incident, July 8th, 4:43 p.m. Noah glanced at her, his face serious. I hope I never forget how strong you are. You won't, she said. The house was quieter these days. No voicemails filled with excuses. No knocks at the door wrapped in the false smiles. Eric and Shannon had gone silent, retreating into absence now that every path was blocked. Irene kept their numbers saved only as artifacts, their names like fossils in her phone. One afternoon, as the autumn light slanted across the kitchen, Deirdre leaned her cane against the counter and asked, So what's next, Irene? Now that the fights are behind you? Irene poured tea into both cups, the steam rising in thin curls. She answered simply, Living. The word didn't feel like survival anymore. It felt like choice. That evening, Irene's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Noah, short and bright. Aced my civics test. She chuckled softly, the sound surprising even herself. Her fingers tapped out a reply. Proud of you. Keep writing your own laws. The night air slipped in through the open window, carrying the scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. The wind chimes on the porch jingled faintly, their song softer now that peace had settled into the house. But peace had a way of being fragile. The next morning, as Irene sorted the mail at her kitchen table, she froze. Amid the bills and circulars sat an envelope, plain, white, handwritten. The return address in the corner stopped her breath for half a beat. Eric Mallory. Her hands tightened around the envelope. The paper felt warmer than it should have, as though it carried the heat of something unresolved. The envelope waited on the table like a guest refusing to leave. Its white surface caught every slant of sunlight that came through the kitchen window, brighter than the stack of bills beneath it. Irene Mallory didn't touch it at first. She fixed her tea, swept the porch, watered the potted geranium by the steps. But her eyes always circled back to the return address in the corner, Eric Mallory. At last, she sat down. Her hands were steady as she reached for her letter opener. The blade slid across the flap with a whisper, the sound neat, deliberate. She pulled out the card, expecting a torrent. Please, anger, some twisted, justification. Instead, the cover offered only soft blue swirls, and the faint word apologies stamped in looping script. Inside, blank. Not one line, not even his name. The emptiness spoke louder than ink could. This was Eric distilled, present but absent, watching but never standing. It was silence dressed as effort. Irene closed the card and slid it back into the envelope. Her walker squeaked softly as she moved to her desk, opened the drawer where her files lived like layers of armor: trust, medical, photos. She thumbed to the folder labeled in her tidy hand: Afterthoughts. The card slipped inside, resting among scraps of other half-measures people had once offered. She shut the drawer with a click and turned the key. The act wasn't bitter. It was final. Her eyes shifted to the trust binder sitting nearby. Thick, orderly, stamped with seals that no hand could pry apart. She ran her palm across its cover, feeling the raised texture of the lettering. The binder was more than paper. It was her life, crystallized and defended. Every choice sealed, every risk contained. That evening, as dusk lowered itself over Asheville, Irene decided to walk the ramp. The boards carried the smell of fresh rain from the afternoon shower, damp and earthy. The new camera's red light blinked overhead, unblinking, watchful. She moved slowly, her walker clinking softly with each step. The air was cool, edged with wood smoke drifting from a neighbor's chimney. Each breath steadied her chest. Then she heard Noah's sneakers behind her. He didn't announce himself. He just fell into step, silent, steady, his shoulder near hers as they moved down the slope together. Halfway, Irene paused. The cicadas hummed in the trees, their chorus folding into the evening. She turned slightly, her voice just above a whisper, carried by the breeze. "They pushed first," she said. "I finished the motion." Noah looked at her, the seriousness in his young face far older than his years. He didn't ask for explanation. He understood. Together, they continued to the grass below. The yard smelled of wet earth, the blades cool beneath Noah's shoes. Irene stood for a moment, breathing in the air, feeling the quiet settle around her like a cloak. The ramp behind her gleamed faintly in the fading light. No longer a threat, but a boundary she had remade. Inside, the wind chimes above the porch clinked softly, their tune uneven but reassuring. Irene glanced back once more at the house she had armored with signatures and seals. Every corner held proof. Every drawer carried evidence. It was hers, not in theory, not in fragile promise, but in the permanence of law. Her lips pressed into a line. Not sorrowful, not angry, just certain. She leaned closer to Noah, her whisper caring only for him. "My daughter-in-law pushed me from the ramp, and my son looked away, so I pushed them both out of my will forever." The words didn't tremble. They landed like stones. And with that, Irene Mallory walked on, her steps measured, her legacy sealed.